destroying everything on their land. Richard Wilson, BBC News, Northamptonshire.
Although there's still no evidence that foot and mouth has spread overseas, the outbreak continues to cause consternation on the continent. In France, 30,000 more sheep are to be slaughtered. That's on top of 20,000 imported from Britain.
France has gone into overdrive. In addition to 20,000 sheep imported from Britain, they're going to slaughter another 30,000 French ones that have been in contact with them, even though there's no evidence of foot and mouth having crossed the channel. In Germany, though, it seems like a close thing. On this farm near Dusseldorf, sheep from Britain were discovered to have foot and mouth antibodies.
Are railways a safer place to travel? Well, tonight, another major accident on the railways. In this special programme, we'll be investigating what went wrong and asking whether this was just a tragic set of coincidences or another symptom of problems in our transport network. We'll have reaction from the studio and from the crash scene. Harry Gratian is there.
Of fate. Tangled metal, people trapped, fighting for their lives, many of them sadly losing that battle. The rescue services faced with mission impossible. They battled along with villagers to drag people away from the wreckage. Up to now, nothing much has happened in this village of Great Heck, but now it has the kind of headlines it doesn't want to repeat.
It was a race against time when...
Yeah, I do. I could do with some stew.
Well, the images of these crashes are becoming all too familiar. Twisted carriages scattered over the tracks, emergency services climbing over the wreckages. Well, today our cameras had exclusive access to the rescue operation following a medical team from Hull Royal Infirmary. This report from Ian Cundall.
It was a race against time when for some the difference between life and death could be measured in minutes. That the race in so many cases was won is a tribute to hundreds who risked their own lives to get casualties to hospital. When death came to this remote corner of East Yorkshire, it was the part-time firemen of Snaith who were confronted by the devastation. Misdirected by a 999 call, it took them minutes to find the remains of the 445 from Newcastle to London King's Cross.
We turned up, as you can see the carnage behind us. We pulled up and saw this. No casualties walking around or anything, so originally we had to fire pumps, believing that it was just empty trains, and then we started seeing people climbing out the wreckage. The carriages themselves rolled over several times, so bearing that in mind, you're only flesh and bone and you get thrown around in that. To walk away from it, you're doing very well.
With snowstorms reducing visibility in places to less than 100 metres, crews from RAF Leconfield were forced to fly in appalling conditions to get casualties to hospital. 2 seriously injured patients owe their lives to a daring landing in whiteout conditions at St James's Hospital in Leeds.
The better weather has been out to the east, but it is clamping in. It's getting worse today. So if there are any more medical evacuations today by air, then they're going to be quite difficult, I would think, in terms of weather.
Hull Royal Infirmary's flying medical team, led by consultant Paul Grout, shared the risks.
So we're going to have to probably follow the river up to Hull and then wobbling from there. Clear route back to Hull. We should be able to make one of the main hospitals anyway, although we may have to alternate and change en route.
We're hanging on for the moment because they're apparently looking at some heat sources in one of the carriages. They're not sure whether it's human or mechanical, so we need to hang on until we know what's happening on that front.
Right, home. Well, aircraft preps if you need us, we'll bring a kit over for you.
I mean, this is obviously very different from what we normally do, and it's a very different sort of condition because we've got multiple teams as opposed to what we usually do, which is 1 or 2 people from the scene of an accident, either here or out at sea. We're standing by ready in case there are any more people that require our attention here. But we don't know quite what the situation is in terms of what else we're likely to find. As I understand, most of the carriages have now been cleared, but there's still, as you can probably see behind me, work going on to look for possible survivors.
You've actually been in there. What's the situation?
It's a complete mess, as you'd expect with a high-speed train hitting something coming the other way.
And what sort of injuries?
A variety, head injuries, back injuries. We had a chest injury in here that required a tube putting into their chest actually here before we transported. So quite a lot of very serious injuries.
There were to be no more miraculous escapes in the wreckage of the 445. At midday, fire officers announced any remaining heat sources could be linked to electrical equipment. 13 people still trapped in the grotesque remains of their carriages were officially presumed dead, victims of an apparently freak accident on the M62 above. This car, towed on a trailer by a Land Rover, had left the road, careered down an embankment and blocked the line. For the villagers who woke up to tragedy, there was the knowledge that the ensuing collision between the London Express and a coal train could have been far worse.
I think I'm incredibly lucky, and I think the person next door family are. You know, it could have been a lot worse. I mean, if you know, some of these large bogies off these trucks had taken off into the air, they could have gone straight through into the house, couldn't they?
Many who'd had narrower escapes were taken to hospital.
Just reading my paper, and then suddenly there's all this noise and the train started making funny movements. You just felt like you're hitting a branch or something to start with, and it just got worse. So that was it. I can't remember anything else.
But few had been as well prepared for the disaster that enfolded at Selby than the wife of Bill Shaw, who survived the Lockington train crash 15 years ago. He'd often talked about how to escape a derailment. Mrs. Shaw suffered a broken leg.
She said to me, I did exactly what you said. I mean, that was one of the second things she said. I'm okay. I did what you said. I got down on the floor.
Tonight, emergency crews are preparing to recover the remains of those who died, and the rail industry is beginning to count the cost of yet another terrible tragedy.
Ian Cundall reporting. Well, with me in the studio now is Ernie Preston from the North East Rail Passenger Committee and the BBC's transport correspondent, Alan Whitehouse. Alan, you've been reporting on railway matters for many years. What was your reaction when you turned on your radio this morning and heard of this tragedy?
Complete disbelief. I couldn't believe that lightning had effectively struck in the same place twice, Peter. You know, it's only 5 months since GNER went through the trauma of Hatfield, and now this, completely unexpected. We've heard the word freak, or the phrase freak accident, used several times, many times today, and that's what this is. It's a freak accident. It's also, I think, a road accident that happens to involve trains. This is an accident completely unlike Hatfield. There are no issues here about how well the railway equipment's being maintained, whether any of it is inherently faulty, whether there was a problem with the train, the track or the signals. This is purely and simply an accident that began with a road vehicle on the motorway above.
This is a company, a railway company, GNER, in the middle of a comeback, trying to woo back passengers onto the network. I mean, what kind of setback is this?
I think it's a huge setback, Peter. Next month, March, was meant to be the springboard, the big recovery from Hatfield and the broken rails crisis, the speed restrictions, and the passenger numbers that have fallen away as a result. GNER and other train companies were planning big fare offers, big promotions to try to win passengers back, to rebuild confidence in railways as a safe and efficient and reliable way of getting around the country. You look at today's pictures and you can't help but see that confidence being destroyed before your eyes.
Only Preston, I use this line. People from Newcastle, York, Doncaster get on these trains. We park our cars, we buy our tickets, we buy our newspapers. But as soon as that air-conditioned carriage door opens, we think we're safe. We settle back in our seats. I don't think I'm going to feel like that anymore.
I think it's a very understandable reaction. I think people are affected in different ways by things like this. Like you, I use that line regularly. I don't have any qualms because I believe the railways are basically safe.
Are we being irrational then?
No, not being irrational at all. I think, as Alan's just said, that what we have here seems to be a freak sequence of events which have led to a tragedy. And we're being promised a rapid inquiry with an intermediate report in the very near future. Hopefully, you know, that will confirm what we believe, that it's nothing wrong with the railway. It was just tragedy.
We'll come back to some of those issues later. Thank you. Well, before today, Great Heck was just a small place name on the map. Tonight, it'll be remembered for the same reasons as Hatfield and Paddington. Harry Grayson is there.
Yes, the wrong reasons, Peter. I don't know whether you can see behind me at the moment, they're building a temporary roadway, but two of the people who were on the scene very, very early on this morning, Dean Puddifoot and Cyril Roberts. Dean, can I start with you first of all? What did you see when you arrived here?
Well, I arrived about 7 o'clock. There were emergency vehicles that had already arrived, and there were more arriving. The scene was one where it was utter devastation, carnage, twisted metal and all the other descriptions that other people have used today. People were being carried out on stretchers, people were being helped from the wreckage.
But the overall feeling I got was one of peace and calm. There were no sirens. Everybody was going about the job in the way, in a very professional manner.
That is, in a sense, is really, really surprising, because you'd expect a total panic situation. Really.
Yeah, no panic at all. It was all very calm, and the emergency services were quite determined and purposeful in what they were doing all the time. Very impressive.
Can I move on to the Reverend Sir Roberts? Again, what did you see when you got here?
Well, I didn't see the wreckage at first because there were quite a lot of people who'd walked away from the accident. That in itself was incredible when you see the amount of damage that was done. And they were sort of milling around and in a farmyard looking really just shocked and bewildered. Local people had sort of opened farm offices and so on, and were making tea and somewhere warm for them to sit, and they were being dealt with. But that was my first impression, was people really shocked and bewildered.
Do you think you helped when they saw you a reverend?
Well, I hope so. I don't know, but I hope so. And I wasn't the only one here. There was the Vicar of Selby was here, and the two of us worked together, both with the walking wounded and then with the more seriously injured in the barn, which was used as a triage post.
Dean, how do you think the people will react around here? Because they're being praised by the Prime Minister for the way that they responded to the accident. Is it something that they'll get over very, very quickly, or will it always be with them, do you think?
I think it'll always be with them, Harry. To be perfectly honest, I think there's a great deal of sadness, there's a great deal of shock. I've seen tears and drawn faces today. Obviously, we're all proud of our village, and you know, we'd rather be proud of it for other reasons than what we've been through today.
And basically, do you get the same kind of feeling that the resilience of people, though, will help them cope with what going to be something that will last with them for a long time?
Yes, I think it will. They draw together traditionally in this community, and they'll support one another. We are doing a little bit as well. We're opening the church in the community. It's been open this afternoon. It'll be open for the next couple of days and staff for people who want to go and talk and have a little bit of help and a sympathetic ear and a cuddle or a prayer.
And just one final point. Were you surprised at all, if you could answer quickly, I'd be grateful, that people rushed out to help in the way that they did? I mean, it's just a natural reaction?
Not surprised at all. There just seems to be a tremendous spirit in the village, and I think people would genuinely want to help anybody who was in distress.
Dean and Cyril, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. For the time being, back to you, Peter, in the studio.
Now you're watching a special programme in the north following today's rail crash in which 13 people died. In a moment, rail safety. What can we do to make tragedies like this a thing of the past? Well, it seems that the accident may have been triggered by a set of circumstances that may never be repeated. But how did a relatively minor accident on the M62 turn into a major rail incident with such a huge loss of life? Tom Ingall's been investigating.
It's almost 18 hours since the crash, and work for the emergency services goes on. It will be many hours still before their immediate work is done. For another team, though, months of hard work is just beginning. In the air are the Health and Safety Executive's investigators, untangling what appears to have been a dreadful chain of events that cost 13 lives. It began as a Land Rover pulling a car on a trailer westbound along the M62 left the carriageway. It was close to the bridge over the East Coast main line, but at least 30 metres before the bridge's crash barrier began. It travelled approximately 100 metres from the road before ending up on the track. The driver phoned the emergency services. Approaching and travelling at 125 miles an hour was the 4:45 a.m. Newcastle to London service. At 6:12, the collision, only 40 seconds after the phone call to the emergency services. The train derailed but crucially remained upright. It travelled for another half a mile. On the other line, a freight train was travelling at 60 miles an hour. It collided with the carriages of the passenger train just 15 seconds later. 17 wagons of coal loaded to 1,000 tonnes. Tonight, Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott launched an inquiry.
It's essential that this appalling tragedy is subject to the fullest investigation. There are a number of agencies involved in this: the Health and Safety Executive, the Railway Inspectorate, the British Transport and North Yorkshire Police, and indeed the Highways Agency. All of them will be conducting their own investigation. I've asked the Health and Safety Executive, therefore, to provide me with an interim report within the next few days. I shall then make a decision as to what further steps may be appropriate, and I shall assure that the report is made public.
Both train drivers died in the crash, but it's believed both braked to avoid the separate impacts, that neither train had enough distance to stop, with such little warning. This section of the East Coast Main Line was modernised in the early 80s and then electrified at the start of the 90s. It's one of the fastest sections of the line. In the 40 seconds from the time the first phone call was made by the car driver, the passenger train would have travelled 1.5 miles.
The maximum speed here is 125 miles an hour for passenger trains, of course. The freight train in question would be authorised to run at 75 miles an hour, but perhaps might have been going a little slower, 60 to 65 miles an hour. We'll have to wait and be told about that.
The M62 is one of the busiest motorways in the country. Questions have already been raised today about crash barriers, but because the embankment well before the bridge, the car driver himself may hold the key to the investigation. One possible theory is his car suffered a tyre blowout. He's being questioned by police. Tonight, the dead and injured were remembered at a church service in nearby Snaith. This has been another terrible day for the National Railway, but according to a Railtrack statement tonight, the industry was powerless to prevent it.
Tom Ingle reporting. Well, safety has never been more in question. Still with me are Ernie Preston and Alan Whitehouse. And joining us from London now is rail safety expert Andrew Evans, who's a Professor of Transport Safety at University College London. Professor Evans, Railtrack have said today that this was an accident that the railway industry was powerless to prevent. Do you accept that?
I think so. What I don't know yet is quite what the timings are, what the intervals between when the road vehicle arrived on the track and how far away the trains were. But from all I've heard, the events were so quick that no one could have done anything about it.
How can we have a situation where a motor vehicle finds its way onto the track in front of a speeding train? I mean, doesn't this say something about problems with separation of the roadway from the railway?
Yes, I mean, there are numerous places where motorways cross railways. I think the most promising avenue would be to see whether anything could be done about the crash barriers of motorways over railways, but I think this is a very freak accident.
There are only a few hundred places, I understand, where motorways cross railways. And I understand that the extent of the crash barriers on the motorway bridge are only about 30 metres beyond the curtilage of the bridge itself. Now, isn't that something that could be looked at straight away?
Well, I think that is something that could be looked at. I mean, there is... One doesn't want to also have a situation where the barriers cause the road vehicle to go back onto the motorway. That is equally dangerous.
Alan Whitehouse, just to broaden this out, I understand that the driver of the car was actually trying to alert the driver of the train by his mobile phone. Now, in the 21st century, surely there should be better communications along the track. We've heard some today about tripwires that could possibly be installed. Is that a viable option?
I think it's not really, Peter, and I think any number of safety precautions today wouldn't have averted this accident. As Andrew has just made the point, it all happened so quickly. We're talking about a matter of seconds between the car finishing upon the railway tracks and the first impact. We're talking about a matter of a few more seconds before the second impact involving the coal train. It simply couldn't have been averted. The only area where tripwires are used on Britain's railway system are in the Highlands of Scotland, where one or two lines which are prone to rockfalls or avalanches because they cross mountainous country have a system of tripwires fixed to signals, and if the wire breaks, the signal goes to danger, the train driver gets advance warning of a rockfall or problems on the line ahead. I think it will be utterly impractical to fit a system like that to the entire rail network.
One would like to think that the rail corridor could be made an exclusion zone for motor vehicles intruding upon it, from passengers and from vandals getting on it. Now, is that conceivable?
Well, I think there's no such thing as anti-vandal fencing. Your Railtrack spend many hundreds of thousands of pounds on anti-vandal measures every year, and no matter what type of fencing you put up, sooner or later somebody finds a way of getting over it, under it or across it. The issue of keeping cars out of the way of trains, well, it may be that the crash barriers where motorway and trunk road bridges cross railways need some attention, and maybe that's an area that would do with looking at.
Ernie Preston, are you satisfied that this is an industry which takes safety seriously?
The railway industry takes safety extremely seriously. You know, when they say that it's first priority, I believe it, and I think it demonstrates that is so. I'm interested in what was said by Professor Evans on the crash barriers. And whereas there may not be many places where motorways cross railways, there are hundreds of places where main roads, Alan mentioned trunk roads, but dual carriageways of all sorts. And whereas it's fortunately not very common, this I think you'll find if you check back is not the first time that a motor vehicle has ended up on a railway line.
Professor Evans, one simple suggestion then. A lot of these injuries today we hear were caused by people actually being thrown about within the carriage. What about seatbelts?
Yes, I mean, I think that's a possibility. It would only be on high-speed trains. I don't think seatbelts would be feasible on the majority of commuter trains, which would be too crowded and probably not so important.
You see, we hear of Grand Prix drivers getting out of crashes at 180 miles an hour. Surely there's something in kind of the design of these carriages that may be made to make these accidents more survivable.
I mean, there has been, well, as far as the crash worthiness is concerned, I think there have been steady improvements and there will continue to be improvements. I think in some ways this accident did demonstrate, as I think somebody said earlier in the programme, that they are, in a sense, given the carnage, they are remarkably well constructed. I think it's possible that further work can be done, and perhaps further work has been done following the previous accidents on the interiors of vehicles, of railway vehicles. But it's very difficult to stop, say, luggage flying about.
Alan, can you deal quickly with this? I've heard this theory about there may have been a problem with the configuration of this train. It was this push-pull arrangement where the heavier loco was at the back. Could that have been a contributory factor?
All the suggestions tonight, Peter, are that no. The theory is this, that you have a fixed set of carriages with a locomotive at one end which is heavy, and you have a sort of a dummy locomotive at the other end, basically an empty shell with a driving cab on the end. And when the train is heading in one direction, the driver drives from this end and the heavy locomotive pushes. That was happening this morning, and the theory is this, that the lighter weight dummy end of the train, as it were, hits the wreckage and rides up and derails more easily than a heavy locomotive would. I think the one thing that discounts that theory is the fact that the train stayed upright after the impact. You would expect the train to have slewed all over, perhaps overturned in the first impact, if this lighter weight end of the train had derailed. All the suggestions are, in fact, that the train behaved exactly as the designers intended in an accident. It stayed upright, it buckled a little with the couplings flexing in the middle to help absorb the energy of the impact. And in fact, but for the second impact with the coal train, the injuries here would have been remarkably few.
Alan, gentlemen, thank you for the moment. So where does this leave GNER? 2 major accidents in 4 months. Now, reporter Penny Bustin is with the company's chief executive, Christopher Garnett.
Thank you, Peter. Well, you join me at a rather sombre York railway station where they've been trying to come to terms today with the thought that some of the people that got on the 5:59 service from this particular platform this morning will not be returning home this evening. I'm joined now by the chief executive of GNER, Christopher Garnett. You must think of this as a completely weird sort of day, really.
The day I never thought we would have again, having had the terrible accident at Hatfield. But unlike Hatfield, which was a railway accident, today's accident was one where a car came onto the track, and then we had this freak incident of our train hitting it, the freight train coming the other way. Just unbelievably ghastly.
What are the chances of that happening again?
Billions to one. I mean, it really is a freak accident. But tragically, we've had a freak accident, and we've had some of our staff killed, we've had passengers killed, we've got staff injured and passenger injured, and our whole worry and concern goes out to them. We don't know the full details of that yet. We're waiting for the information.
What could be done to prevent something like this ever happening again?
Well, clearly, I'm sure that the road safety people will now look at this and say, do we have the barriers on motorways and on A roads in the right place to make sure that cars cannot get onto the railway? I mean, the railways have a very rigorous process of reviewing after accidents, and after Hatfield we have done so much to improve rail safety. We really are desperately trying to make the railways safer. We hope that work is also going to go on and review what happened on the road.
Mr. Garnett, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. With that, it's back to the studio. Peter.
Thanks, Penny. Well, more from me in a moment, but back now to Harry at Great Heck, close to the crash side.
Well, the village of Great Heck is almost a classic village in many respects. It consists of 2 pubs and 1 church. Can I ask Pat and Len to tell me something about the character of the village? Len, first of all.
It's a quiet village, but people are commuting to the larger cities, into Leeds, Bradford, Selby, Pontefract. It's usually at the weekends when we see more of them, and when people do come out.
You've been inundated today with the world media. How have you reacted to that?
Well, I think at first people were quite shocked with all the mayhem and ever.
Do you think they'll come to terms with this? I mean, obviously what's happened here is a devastating accident. Do you think it would affect them, or will they brush it off in years to come?
Probably do.
Time. Tomorrow when the media will quieten down somewhat, then people will probably think about it. And then, like I say, for months, years to come, it's something that's great going to be remembered by. It was a train accident. It's not something that we wanted this village to be remembered by.
Len and Pat, thank you very much indeed. Well, a couple of the regulars are sitting down here as well, Dave Till and Dave Chandler. Dave, how do you think the village will come to terms with what's happened here?
I think it'll take time. It's such a surprise and it's such a small village. You just don't expect something like this to happen on your doorstep. It's amazing.
What about your own situation, Dave? Because you heard the crash first thing this morning.
Yeah, we heard it about 6:15 and it woke us up, but at the time we didn't really think anything of it because we get a lot of noises around here with the trains and the line and the block work, so we didn't really think. But then my wife went to work, she went up the motorway and rang me back and said there's been a bad train crash, but by this time all the ambulances were coming past, so we just let them get on with it.
A lot of people have been praising, Dave, the villagers themselves went to rush and try and help. Is that typical of the kind of characters that live around here?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, people will always help you out, sort of thing. You know, especially in a situation like this, then people go out of their way to help others, sort of thing. So, yeah.
How long do you think it will take, Dave, to get over this?
I think, being realistic, I think for us people who live here, probably in a few weeks it'll be forgotten about, but obviously for the people who are more directly involved in it, it'll take a long time for those to get over it, if ever.
Dave Chandler and Dave Till, thank you very much indeed. Well, obviously, with the scale of the accident that happened just a couple of hundred yards or so down the road, there's going to be wide-scale disruption to services for many days, possibly weeks and months to come. Let's find out what the latest is by joining Claire Frisbee at York Railway Station.
Yes, Harry, thank you. On an empty newspaper stand here in York reads the headline that people here in the north and the northeast will always remember. It's the day that we witnessed our worst railway crash. Now, this morning, 30 people bought tickets and boarded the train here in York. They got on the train heading south. For many, of course, it was a routine journey. Then, of course, there was the little girl having a day out with her mum, the young woman who was heading to London for her drama audition, and a senior GNER executive who was heading to his desk at King's Cross. They were all boarding the 5:59. They were joining passengers who were coming from further up the line, from Northallerton, from Darlington, Durham and Newcastle. But 13 of those passengers hadn't returned home this evening. In that crucial half hour before catching the train, they bought their tickets for their car parks and left them in their cars. Tonight, those tickets are still sitting there, and the cars tonight are uncollected.
Been with GNE, Claire, you've been with GNER people all day. I mean, what's the feeling like that? This must have been devastating for their morale.
Yes, Peter, it's a very sombre atmosphere here this evening. As Penny said earlier, you can see that the station tonight is deserted, it's cold, and earlier I was talking to some of the workers who are loading up the mail sacks to get onto the night train. There was a very, very depressed atmosphere because they're thinking about their colleagues who were killed in the train crash. And tonight, interestingly, when you talk to other passengers who have been moving through the station trying to find out information, it's been very interesting. Some are undeterred by it, but some are saying, okay, it was a freak accident, but I still have no confidence, and if I have to choose to travel tomorrow, I will choose an alternative mode of transport and will not be taking the train. That may seem irrational, because after all, it was a car accident that led to a freak chain of events that caused today's terrible disaster.
Claire, thank you. Well, confidence in safety on the railways must now be at an all-time low. Ernie and Alan are still with me, and joining us now from London is the MP for Selby, John Grogan. John, if we could pick up this issue of confidence in the network, many of your constituents will be regular commuters. Have you been able to gauge yet how they're going to be feeling about getting on a train again tomorrow?
Well, I think they're going to be worried about getting on a train tomorrow, some of them, even though rail transport, as we've heard, is much more safe than road transport. 10 people will probably died on the roads today. That's what on average happens. But people, when they go on a train, I think feel that they're entrusting their safety to someone else. and they feel these accidents terribly. Now, fortunately, as the Deputy Prime Minister announced, there is an inquiry, but there's a broader inquiry been going on for the last year into railway safety after the other terrible accidents that have occurred over the last 3 years, called the Cullen Inquiry, and this will report in April and May, and there'll be a big job then for the government and the railway companies to act on that report and try and get some renewed confidence in the system.
Yeah, is there a tendency for us to get these widely reported, high-profile public service accidents out of proportion?
Well, they are terrible. They stick in the mind, and I don't think it's irrational. I think it's human nature. But I think people are questioning quite how the railway system is organised at the moment. The railway companies themselves say, as did the Select Committee on Transport, that we need a new national rail safety authority independent of Railtrack, and I think that's true. And I think we do need some pretty dramatic measures now to increase confidence in both the safety and indeed the efficiency of rail.
Alan, remind us of the relative risks comparing rail travel to other forms of transport.
Sitting in a car, you're between 5 and 7 times at greater risk of having an accident than sitting on a train. And research published in the last few days shows the long-term trend for rail accidents is improving all the time. In fact, it doesn't feel like it on a day like today. But railways are getting safer. And if you look at accidents per billion train kilometres, it's the accepted way of looking at accident rates. It's the way airlines, for example, measure their safety record. So accidents per billion train kilometres. Back in 1967, there were about 10 train accidents per billion train kilometres. That figure is now down to less than 2. It's about 1.75. In other words, railways are about 6 times safer than they were in 1967. Now, that's far better than anything that's been achieved on the roads, despite the fact that train speeds are much higher now than they were back in the mid-1960s.
Ernie, isn't it true that all these improvements in safety are dismissed almost out of hand when you see that blue and red livery of GNER rolling stock in the middle of a field?
Yes, it's extremely sobering to see that kind of thing, but nevertheless, what Alan's just said, pointing to those statistics, I think that the railways, despite what's happened today and in recent months, is still an extremely safe place to be. And I think that we should, ask people to be very careful before dismissing rail because of what's happened, because they could perhaps be putting themselves into greater danger by choosing to travel by a different mode.
John Grogan, commercially speaking, the main line's closed again now. What long-term implications are there here for GNER?
Well, for GNER and also other train companies like Hull Trains, which have just started up a service through Selby and Doncaster, it's obviously going to be some very difficult months ahead. I mean, GNER is recognised, I think, as a very good train company, which has well-motivated staff and so on, and takes safety seriously. But it's not just the train company that's going to be in problems. The whole economy of Yorkshire depends on having a fast, reliable, safe link with London. It's clearly going to be knocked off for a week or two now. And it's not just the train company, it's the whole population of Yorkshire that depends on re-establishing that link as soon as possible.
Final quick word, Alan. What's the way back for the railways now?
I think rebuilding confidence. But let me leave you with some figures to play with. Since Clapham, 120 people have been killed on the railways. That's including today's total. So 12 people per year 10 people per year on average have died on the railway network over the last 12 years. That's happening on the roads every day.
Alan Whitehouse, Ernie Preston, John Grogan, thank you. Well, more on the crash and its effect in a moment, but first a roundup of the day's other news. And the foot and mouth crisis has taken another turn for the worse. Exclusion zones have been set up around 4 farms in Cumbria, 3 to the north of Carlisle, and 1 near Penrith, while tests are carried out for the disease. And a farm at Pinchbeck in Lincolnshire is also under investigation. 2 other farms in East and North Yorkshire were examined, but so far no signs of the infection have been found. One of the farmers at the centre of the foot and mouth outbreak has been speaking to the BBC. Since Sunday night, the carcasses of hundreds of pigs which were farmed by Bobby Waugh and his brother Heddon on the Wall have been burning. Mr. Waugh says it's too early to say the foot and mouth outbreak started on his farm.
I think I'm not the cause of it. Nobody knows the cause of it. The ministry don't know the cause of it. It's just nobody knows the cause of it. It's just like having a flu bug. You don't know if you're going to get it. That's it. All the practices I've used on my farm has been right. I've done everything legal. and that's as far as I can go. I can't go any further than that.
The blizzard seems to have finally stopped, but snow is still causing serious disruption, particularly in the north of the region. Some communities have been without power for more than 24 hours. Motorists faced huge problems and schools were forced to close because of the appalling weather. The Yorkshire-based Bradford and Bingley Bank has announced that it's closing 68 branches with a loss of 300 jobs. The former building society has blamed the closures on the cost of its conversion to a bank late last year. Well, of course, today's accident has had a massive ripple effect on people's travelling plans. In case you're heading out tomorrow, here's Tom Ingle with the latest travel information.
Thanks, Peter. Well, today's events have caused serious problems for travellers on the East Coast Main Line. It's closed to all services between York and Doncaster. A revised timetable is now in operation on the line. The advice to people still needing to travel is to use the hourly service between London, King's Cross and Leeds, and then use Northern Spirit services that run regularly between Leeds and York. Services between London and Leeds are running, but there's a train shuttle between York and Newcastle. GNER themselves are operating a limited service from York to the northeast and Scotland. Trains from Hull are also affected. Services to and from London are not calling at Selby, though they are still running. And from tomorrow until at least Monday, Hull trains are increasing their capacity on the services on the East Coast Main Line. Of course, do check before you travel. There may be some replacement buses operating, so do leave yourself plenty of extra time to travel. That's all from the travel desk.
Well, that's about it from me. The national weather follows in a moment. First, can we go over to Harry?
Yes, there's a great deal of activity going on here at the moment, Peter. You can probably see in the background the diggers at work. Now, they're building a temporary roadway for the heavy lifting machinery to come in. This has been a freak accident, and there's been some magnificent work from the rescue services today. Small consolation, perhaps, that they have worked and battled against all of the elements, and they've done an absolutely magnificent job. Back to you.
Thanks, Harry. Well, the national weather, as I was saying, follows in a moment, but you can join a debate taking place on your local BBC radio station this evening on today's tragic events. It's on the air now, and it runs until 1 a.m. But we leave you tonight with images from the crash scene at Great Hick, near Goole.
Good evening. Well, February 2001 is just about to draw to a close, and it looks as though it's been the coldest February since 1996. Not particularly spectacular. It was also very wet in the southeast of England and in East Anglia, and in County Durham, just on one morning, we saw 33 centimetres of snow. And that wintry weather is going to be staying with us into the start of March. The northerly winds bringing that cold air still down across the country right the way through into the weekend. The winds will be light, so that means we will see problems with mist and fog. And then you can see a dramatic change into next week. Those winds turning southerly, coloured yellow and orange, indicate some very mild air indeed. And by then we'll see the snow melting, and we'll also perhaps have some problems with flooding. But back to tonight, we've still got some snow, wet snow mainly in the southeast here, some sleet and some rain. There will be snow showers continuing around the fringes in Scotland, and also I think some will come into Northern Ireland, particularly into the west of the province. But inland it will be a very clear, cold night. Once more over the snowfields, -10, -12, quite feasible, -5, -7 in Northern Ireland. And then for tomorrow, that weather front is still trapped down in the south and the east, so another cloudy day to come here, and that means some further wet snow, some sleet and some rain. Really nuisance value rather than anything else. Further afield, a good deal of dry, sunny, crisp weather, with still those snow showers in the north, coming down the east coast during the day and the west coast during the afternoon.
To the men and women at the heart of the national chance to voice your concerns. Nikki Campbell and Philippa Forrester examine the cost of cheap food production in the Foot and Mouth Special, tomorrow, 8:10 on BBC One.
This is BBC One in the North. Now, the news at 10 o'clock with Michael Burke and Ian White.
Foot and mouth is now out of control and in all parts of the country.
25,000 cattle, sheep and pigs have now been slaughtered. The car driver who caused yesterday's train disaster says he didn't fall asleep. Earthquake.com, the day it started raining bricks in Seattle. And Hogwarts and all, the Harry Potter film and a lesson in wizard marketing.
And here in the north, the Selby train crash. We'll be getting the latest from our reporter who's in the village of Great Heck. And the truth is out there, the mysterious hole that had scientific brains fooled.
Good evening. The Agriculture Minister, Nick Brown, admitted today that attempts to contain the foot and mouth epidemic had failed. It's now known to have spread to Scotland and Northern Ireland. 25,000 animals have so far been destroyed. The Prime Minister said tonight it was impossible to judge how serious the outbreak would become and how long it would last. This is the position tonight. It's been confirmed that 2 farms in Dumfries and Galloway in Scotland are infected. And in Northern Ireland, it's appeared on a farm in South Armagh. There are 3 new cases in England, 2 in Cumbria and 1 in Tyne and Wear. That brings the total of confirmed cases to 32. First, Richard Bilton on a crisis getting worse every day.
No part of the country has been spared. The terrible fires have now become part of life in rural Britain. Wherever this disease appears, the farmer knows his animals and his livelihood will be burnt away. Today it was Scotland's turn to face the horrible fact that foot and mouth had arrived. 2 new cases, 1 placed this highly infectious disease on a farm near the centre of Lockerbie. In this deepening crisis, tonight's angry heckling greeted Tony Blair on a visit to Gloucester to see for himself the effects on the countryside. Once inside, he tried to address their concerns.
We are at a stage where a lot of you aren't managing and are feeling real difficulty and pain. Now, we can work with you to get the right answers to that. I mean, that's my offer to you.
He went on to raise broader questions about intensive farming and the direction the industry was heading.
There's no doubt at all. I mean, we all want cheaper food in our shops. But on the other hand, I think the supermarkets, I mean, not to put too fine a point out, have pretty much an arm lock on you people at the minute. Now, that's something we are sitting down and trying to work through with them at the moment, and we've got to be careful as to how we do that.
The fear in the countryside is that this disease will spread further. Tonight in Powys, Mid Wales, an area with already 2 confirmed cases, police patrols have been stepped up after a farmer was seen illegally moving his animals around.
So dangerous, irresponsible, and it could mean that the infection could be communicated to other lambs and sheep in other fields.
In hundreds of rural communities, the focus now is keeping this disease away. Some farmers say that work is being undermined by walkers who are still ignoring the warnings to stay out of the countryside.
I've seen people walking their dogs today on my farm. I had to walk away because I didn't want to get into an argument.
The scale of what is happening to the country is horrifying for the man who was first to spot the outbreak. Vet Craig Kirby spoke today for the first time of knowing he'd found foot and mouth at an Essex abattoir.
I was actually on the phone at the time, and somebody told me that it was coming through as a positive foot and mouth disease, and my hand started shaking and the receiver started shaking, because I never expected to see foot and mouth disease in the whole of my working career.
What he saw is now disrupting British life. Tonight there are doubts over the Cheltenham Racing Festival. The Irish government has asked punters not to travel.
It's a huge disappointment to everybody concerned, not least of whom are the Irish owners and trainers themselves, as well as the Irish public. You know, it's the last thing that anybody would ever envisage that the Irish would do. But their government has given them a very, very strong steer that coming here would be the wrong thing to do.
And Crust has gone. The dog show postponed because a gathering involving so many people from the countryside now carries too much risk. The government's vets still have no idea how many cases we will finally see, how far this crisis in rural Britain will go. Tony Blair said tonight the most important thing was to get the disease under control. He saw for himself that many in the countryside think that battle may already be lost. Richard Bilton, BBC News, Downing Street.
Well, our political editor, Andrew Marr, is in Gloucester with the Prime Minister. Andrew, you'd expect Tony Blair to tell farmers that he felt their pain.
you perhaps wouldn't expect him to call into question the whole industrialisation of agriculture.
Certainly not. I mean, it's not a very dramatic setting, perhaps, but what Tony Blair has just said is indeed dramatic in political terms. He's used words like sustainability, organic farming, and he's been talking about, in an extraordinary phrase, the arm lock that the supermarkets have got on the farmers. Now, the supermarkets, of course, are fantastically powerful, great big players in the economic system. Lord Sainsbury, for one, just paid £2 million to the Labour Party, so this is provocative stuff from the Prime Minister. The other parties will jump on it, and I think we'll have a great argument about the whole question, the future of British farming, and that's going to go right the way through the election campaign.
They're still not saying much about the impact of all this on the date of the election. What's going on behind the scenes?
Well, behind me there's some wild students, but behind the scenes inside the Labour Party, there is a great argument about the future of the, these are sort of pro-hunting or anti-hunting, I'm not entirely sure which, but there's a great argument going on about whether they're going to have to delay the election. Nick Brown, the Agriculture Minister, has said earlier today that Labour MPs are coming to him and saying, listen, it's unfair to run a general election campaign with all this going on. Within 2 weeks, the government is going to have to cross its fingers and take a decision, may or not.
Andrew, thanks very much. The Northern Ireland Executive will hold an emergency meeting tomorrow to discuss Ulster's first ever case of foot and mouth. A 3-mile exclusion zone has been thrown around the farm where the disease was discovered at Mike in County Armagh. Ireland correspondent Dennis Murray reports from there.
A 3-hour queue to cross the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, caused by the outbreak of foot and mouth disease just 2 miles away. It's the first in Northern Ireland's history.
Very sorry for the delay. Have you been on your farm on the last couple of weeks?
No meat or dairy products are being allowed through. Some drivers even had their personal drinks taken from them.
It's taking milk. We have to have rubbish that as well. Any dairy products at all like that.
This is the main Belfast-Dublin road, but there are hundreds of so-called unapproved roads crisscrossing the border, causing the Irish government grave concern that some of the infected sheep came south.
We are here dealing with a consignment of sheep that came into the country illegally. There is a culture of smuggling and illegality in relation to some border activities from that region.
An exclusion zone's been imposed round the farm at Mike in South Armagh, where the outbreak was confirmed, and it's now at the centre of a potentially devastating threat to Ulster's biggest single industry, agriculture. As sheep here were being destroyed overnight, police stopped at least 2 trucks moving livestock from the area, and a man was questioned by the RUC as the authorities tried to establish how and under what kind of permit the sheep came to South Armagh. The chairman of the devolved Agriculture Committee said there should be an inquiry.
What is the use of having a permit and not letting your beasts in here, except you're taking them to an abattoir, and then when you get them in, you can say toodaloo and do what you like with them.
The threat is such that all across Northern Ireland, what's been dubbed fortress farming is beginning. No one in and no one out as far as is possible, even miles away from South Armagh. In Ireland, this is already a crisis. It's now clear that it's how that's managed from here on that'll decide whether it will become a disaster. Agriculture provides 6% of Northern Ireland's gross domestic product. That figure's even higher in the Irish Republic, and in both cases much, much higher than in Britain. So the consequences of a widespread outbreak here could be catastrophic for the economy of the whole island. Dennis Murray, BBC News, South Armagh.
And now for the latest from Ireland and Scotland. Dennis Murray is in Armagh, but first Andrew Castle in Lockerbie. Andy, 2 confirmed cases in the borders, and I gather real concern that there'll be another confirmed case, or possibly another confirmed case in central Scotland tomorrow.
That's right, Mike. I'm told that the animals at that 3rd farm, which is at Polmont near Bowness on the 4th, are suspected to have been in contact with livestock that have already had the disease. They have taken tests. Those tests have been sent away, and they're expecting the results tomorrow. But frankly, the Scottish Executive has said today that it's looking pretty bleak, and they don't think that it will even end at that farm. But right now, tonight, the pain is being felt a few metres behind the signs you see behind me here. All afternoon, they've been valuing the sheep and the cattle on this farm, Nether Place in Lockerbie, and then they've destroyed the sheep, and they will be destroying the cattle overnight. And tomorrow, that familiar, now distressingly familiar site in the British countryside, a pyre will be built and they will be incinerated. On top of all this, another 40 to 50 farms are suspected. They have cordons, exclusion zones set around them. These are farms where they suspect they may develop foot and mouth in the days ahead. So restriction orders are being enforced across Scotland.
Dennis, the Dublin government said tonight that the Republic's almost on a war footing, a real sense of crisis.
Oh, absolutely, a real sense of crisis, Michael. In fact, Joe Walsh, the Irish Agriculture Minister, was saying this is a threat that the state has faced since it was invented, since independence was the way he put it, but that means since the 1920s. I mean, even back with that outbreak in the 1960s in Britain, foot and mouth did not cross the Irish Sea, it did not come anywhere in Ireland. So there is a real sense of, I think, huge threat here because, as I said in the report, both north and south are so much more dependent on agriculture. There is a real sense of danger. The Deputy Prime Minister, Mary Harney, was also saying this poses a real threat to the Celtic tiger, the phrase that's been used for the booming economy in the Republic over the last few years.
Dennis and Andy, thanks very much. Police say it could be several days before they can be certain of the final death toll from the Selby rail crash. So far, the bodies of 13 people have been recovered. Tonight, the wife of Gary Hart, the driver of the Land Rover which derailed the train, has denied that he was to blame. Elaine Hart told reporters any suggestion he fell asleep at the wheel was utter rubbish.
Tonight, the huge machinery needed to clear the tangled carriages and debris is being put in place. It's been a day of grim discovery that will live forever with the driver of the Land Rover, Gary Hart. At a news conference, his wife said he's devastated, and she denied reports he'd fallen asleep at the wheel.
He immediately dialed 999 and was telling the operator that he was on a train line and that he could hear a train coming, but she couldn't get through to anybody. He desperately tried to get it stopped, but there's nothing he could do. I'm sorry, I don't say anymore.
Please, could you give her a moment, please? Thank you.
Rescue teams have spent a traumatic day recovering bodies from the train carriages. Human remains were found at 13 different places in the wreckage. It's been painstaking work using specialist teams and cutting equipment. Even the smallest personal belongings must be recorded as evidence. The bodies they found were taken with as much dignity as possible to a temporary mortuary on the site.
No matter how many times you've seen this sort of thing before, you can't harden yourself to it. And I guess it's a matter for individuals. It certainly is emotionally quite draining, and we have to go through quite a lot of trouble to make sure that we support our officers in everything they do.
Tonight, many victims are still being treated in hospital. Some of the survivors have been reliving their ordeal. Paul Briggs from Newcastle was badly hurt in the crash. Despite his injuries, he managed to scramble to safety.
A group of us, 3 women and myself, crawled out of some sort of a hole in the train. I've no idea what. Incredible sense of gratitude that we have survived, and therefore also feeling of guilt. I feel so pleased to be alive. You know, there is that guilt there.
The tiny village of Great Heck has been devastated by this crash. Some local people visited the scene for the first time today. They find it hard to take it all in.
I don't think things will ever be the same. It used to be just a railway line and a bridge here, and now I think every time everybody crosses the bridge or comes here, everybody's going to remember it as something completely different.
2 of the carriages are so badly damaged, rescue teams say they can't be certain there are no further bodies inside. That'll only be known when the carriages are lifted. But that process can't begin until the fingertip search of the wreckage is completed. It will resume in the morning. Catherine Marston, BBC News, North Yorkshire.
The BBC's Kevin Bouquet is at the crash site now. Kevin, the car driver, or rather his wife, says he didn't fall asleep at the wheel, so how did he end up on the track?
Well, the police have made it clear all along that they're looking at all sorts of possibilities, and among them, the possibilities that perhaps there was some sort of mechanical failure in the Land Rover, perhaps there was a tyre blowout, anything could have happened. And they've spent a couple of days up on the motorway along which the Land Rover was driving, They're looking for evidence. They're looking, apart from anything else, for skid marks, something that might give a clue as to what happened. Now, after a couple of days of that, they're not telling us what they've discovered. All they're saying to us is that they are still keeping an open mind with all the options, all the possibilities, including the possibility that the driver might have fallen asleep at the wheel.
Kevin, thanks. The accusation by Chris Woodhead, the former Chief Inspector of English Schools, that government policies have betrayed a generation of children has been dismissed by the Education Secretary, David Blunkett. Mr. Woodhead, who resigned 3 months ago, accused Labour of lurching from one initiative to another. Mr. Blunkett said many of the initiatives had been Mr. Woodhead's ideas.
Although reappointed by them, Chris Woodhead was never enthusiastic about the Labour government. So on the very day his official notice expired, he let rip, saying the government's many initiatives amounted to very little, leaving a black hole at the heart of its education policy. Speaking from North Wales tonight, he blamed ministers for failing to deliver on their rhetoric.
I felt very often, talking to both David Blunkett and to the Prime Minister, that they were on the same wavelength. That's what I was led to believe. But in effect, nothing changed, and that became inevitably increasingly frustrating.
In his article in the Telegraph, Mr. Woodhead specifically attacked the Education Secretary, David Blunkett, saying he has just not delivered. A generation of children has been betrayed. Yet a year ago, in his annual report, Mr. Woodhead was upbeat, saying the quality of teaching has improved in all types of schools, in all subjects, and in all year groups. Teacher Union said Mr. Woodhead was embittered and arrogant, but the Conservatives backed him, saying he'd exposed the spin behind Labour's education policies. Ministers rejected that.
I think the vitriol that has come today against myself and the Prime Minister illustrates frustration rather than clear thinking. The contradictions that have been illustrated from the former Chief Inspector today, who wants more prescription when it suits him and more hands-off when it doesn't.
Ministers had been concerned that Mr. Woodhead could cause them damage during an election campaign, so they may be relieved that he's spoken out so soon, hoping that any future criticism will have less impact after this first blast since his resignation as Chief Inspector. Mike Baker, BBC News, at the Department for Education.
And you can see more of that interview with Chris Woodhead on Newsnight on BBC Two after this programme. The trial of the man accused of murdering the BBC presenter Jill Dando has been adjourned for almost 2 months until April the 23rd. Barry George denies killing Jill at her home in West London in April 1999. The court has forbidden reporting of the reasons for the adjournment. The only 2 survivors of the lorry tragedy at Dover last June, in which 58 illegal Chinese immigrants suffocated, have told Maidstone Crown Court how those inside kicked and screamed for help as they ran out of air. The Dutch lorry driver, Perry Wacker, is accused of killing 58 people. South African helicopters are preparing to return to Mozambique to help rescue people from the rising floodwaters. Officials say more than 100,000 people are at risk from the Zambezi River. The floods have killed at least 52 people since early January and left more than 80,000 homeless. From Mozambique, David Schuckman reports.
Rescue is on its way at last. The river these people depend on has turned against them, and for some, escape seems the only option. These are desperate times. The authorities say the floods are getting worse and could drown anyone who stays. But as these people leave, they know they'll lose everything they own. They face a terrible choice. We found the village of Gapani entirely cut off. There are hundreds like it. People here have watched the flood encircle them. The waters threaten their lives, but they can't decide whether to cling on or try to leave. This house and dozens of others here have now been lost to the flood, which is why so many people have moved to this narrow strip of land, the only area of higher ground they have. The problem is that the river is rising all the time, and already this village has lost its crops, and people are wondering what's going to happen next. The village leaders took me on a journey, rather precarious, to show me how much of their community has been submerged. Half of all the houses. But they haven't given up. They hope to return. One family left its Bible to help that happen. This is the village office, and this was the only way to reach it. The district official, Philippe Luis Monozo, told me how they've endured floods before, this high, but how the government has never helped them. He told me he didn't know what to do, so he asked us for a lift to the local town to try to drum up assistance. We took him, and from the air, Philippe Luis had his first view of the scale of the floods. It was a daunting sight. In the nearby town of Mutarara, he went in search of the provincial administrator. It was a fruitless mission. These two weren't sure where he was. So Philippe Luis waited, hot, restless, unsure what to do. Just up the road, we saw the refugee camp that Philippe Luis and his villagers could soon end up in. They are under canvas here and do get food, but nothing else. The international aid effort is only just starting. We return Philippe Luis to his village, disappointed and confused. He knows he can't count on getting any help, so he's praying the floods won't rise anymore. David Chukman, BBC News, in Mozambique.
Powerful aftershocks have hit northwestern areas of the United States in the wake of yesterday's earthquake, which measured 6.8 on the Richter scale. One person died and 250 were injured in the earthquake, which centered on Seattle and is thought to have caused more than $1 billion worth of damage.
This the moment when Seattle started to shake. For 30 terrifying seconds, people raced onto the streets. Bill Gates, the Microsoft chief, watching a high-tech demonstration, felt the power of Mother Nature. The world's richest man was quickly hustled out of harm's way.
You know, first you wonder, is it an explosion or what is it? But then it kept going on long enough that it's pretty clearly an earthquake.
At a Seattle social services meeting, the quake sounded like a freight train. A surveillance camera captured the panic in this casino. It was every man for himself as punters fled.
Got to the front door here, and it was raining bricks. I mean, it was just raining bricks. It was all powder. You couldn't see anything, and it was pretty scary.
Some buildings were seriously damaged, streets strewn with rubble, but overall, Seattle escaped relatively lightly. On America's west coast, buildings are designed to withstand major quakes. The repair bill, though, will top $1 billion. Emergency crews were out in force. Hundreds of people were injured, many hit by falling masonry. And it was nearly so much worse. These homes on the Pacific shore almost pushed into the sea by an earth slide. As the clear-up continues, there's the usual nagging question on the west coast: when and where will the next quake hit? Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Washington.
BBC News has swept the board at the prestigious Royal Television Society Journalism Awards, winning 10 of the 15 categories. Programme of the year went to Panorama for Who Bombed Omagh. John Ware, who reported on that programme, also won Journalist of the Year. BBC News 24 won the News Event Award for its live coverage of the Belgrade Revolution. And the International News Award went to the 10 o'clock news special correspondent Ben Brown for this report on the Zimbabwe farm invasion.
As some militants patrol the perimeter fence, others are arguing with Mr. Mason at his window. These are moments of terror for him, but he refuses to give in to their demands. Eventually, he contacts local police who come to our rescue. As we make our run for it, we are not allowed to film, and we have to leave behind much of our equipment.
Fans of the fictional wizard Harry Potter have been given a sneak preview of the Hollywood version of their hero's exploits. With nearly 9 months to go before the film's release, the 90-second trailer gives fans a glimpse of J.K. Rowling's magical world of witches and wizards. Arts correspondent Nick Hyam was among the first muggles to see it.
Dear Mr. Potter, it promises to be one of the biggest films of the year. You have been accepted to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Rather cheekily, Warner Brothers chose World Book Day to release this trailer. Question now, can one of the most popular children's books ever survive the transition to the big screen? We asked a panel of Harry Potter experts if the film version lived up to the one in their imaginations.
I thought the costumes were very good because the wizards really looked like wizards.
I was slightly disappointed because when you saw shots of Harry, then you couldn't see his scar, which I think is quite an important part of the book.
When Harry made his broomstick come to his hand, I think that was good, and it would have been good to see him flying on his broomstick.
I thought it was funny when, you know, the people with big ears and the big noses, I thought they was quite funny as well.
The trailer was released today on the internet. As with many films, the net will have an important role to play in building up the pre-release hype. The film's not due into the cinemas until November. Meanwhile, shooting at locations including Gloucester Cathedral is continuing in conditions of great secrecy. Children everywhere seem to devour Harry Potter, even those who never normally read. The question worth asking on World Book Day, will the film version make them more or less likely to read the book? Nick Hyam, BBC News.
It's 26 minutes past 10. I'll be back a little later with an update on the day's headlines. But now we join our news teams across the UK.
Hello, good evening now from Look North. I'm Ian White. As we saw earlier, clearing up operations are continuing tonight at the scene of the Selby rail disaster. During the day, the bodies of 8 passengers were removed from the wreckage and work continued to build the roadway which will enable heavy lifting gear to move the mangled carriages. Meanwhile, as police continue their investigations, the family of Gary Hart, the man whose Land Rover slid onto the railway track, have denied that he fell asleep at the wheel. Well, our reporter Paul Murphy is at Great Heck. Let's join him now live. Paul, what's been happening there this evening?
Well, Ian, within the last couple of hours, North Yorkshire Police have confirmed that all the remains found aboard the wreck have been removed from this site. The official number of dead still stands at 13, although the authorities have said they're keeping an open mind to the possibility that further human remains could be found in the coming days, particularly from 2 carriages at the very front of the train, which bore the brunt of the impact and have been quite badly concertinaed by the impact. These have not been fully accessible to the rescue teams.
So, Paul, pretty poor weather conditions at the moment. Will the work be continuing through the night?
Yes, the weather conditions will not prevent the army of contractors and rescue teams from working here. All around me there is a hum of machinery, ballast lorries coming down to the makeshift roadway, and behind me a large crane is being constructed. The construction of that will continue overnight, the idea being that tomorrow morning or possibly tomorrow afternoon that crane will begin the operation of removing carriages from the track onto the makeshift roadways. Before all of that, though, there'll be a fingertip search of the train and of the immediate area surrounding the train to look for possessions. These are very important when it comes to identifying some of the human remains that have been found here.
OK, Paul Murphy, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Thank you. In other news, a grandfather was murdered by his son and grandson and his body entombed in their house in South Yorkshire, the jury heard today. The killing only came to light 2 years later when the remains of Mohammed Nasser Ali were dumped in a street in Sheffield. Hassan Nasser and Kassan Mohammed deny murder. John Cundy reports.
The house at Hyde Park in Doncaster, which the prosecution claim held a grim secret. For 2 years, the body of an elderly Yemeni man was said to have been entombed in the cellar there after his alleged murder. Mohammed Ali had been killed, it's said, by his son Nasser and his grandson Kassan. Eventually, the prosecution say the men dumped the remains of Mr. Ali's body, wrapped in a hold-all, on waste ground in Sheffield. It remained undiscovered for 2 more months, until 2 passers-by stumbled on the bundle.
Hassan Nasser was later to claim that his father, Mohammed Ali, had lunged at him with a knife in a row, and in the ensuing struggle, the old man had fallen on the knife and died. But the prosecution say Mr. Ali's throat was slit, that his son and grandson buried him in a tomb of bricks and paving slabs, continued to pretend he was still alive, and later made fraudulent benefit claims after his death.
The body of Mr. Ali was identified only after scientists made a clay model of the head as they imagined the man would have looked like. Dental and medical records also helped establish the identity of the 75-year-old. In the Yemeni community of Doncaster, Mohammed Ali was said to have been well respected. But his divorced wife Fatima told the court today, in the confines of his home, Mr. Ali could be brutal, bad-tempered and strict with his family, threatening them with a knife which he often carried. The trial is expected to last a fortnight.
Police in Derbyshire have confirmed they're investigating alleged threats against a number of FA inquiry into Chesterfield Football Club. Police spokesman said they had started the investigation as a result of information received from the FA. He said witnesses were being interviewed to establish whether any criminal offences had been committed. Yorkshire's scientific community was left baffled today. There was even talk of one of the greatest finds of the century, a meteor from another planet. However, it all turned out to be something of an anticlimax. But Trudy Scanlon found out.
This is the smoking hole in the ground that had everyone baffled. Did one of the largest meteorites to ever fall to Earth lie at the bottom of it? The area was sealed off. The bomb squad brought in, and some of Yorkshire's finest scientists were getting very excited.
I do not want anyone going too near it, and we're going to try and diagnose whether it is of this Earth, i.e. someone's dropped something out of an aeroplane which would have had to have accelerated at a phenomenal velocity to embed itself in the ground like that. Is it possibly a piece of a satellite? Or is it something that we have never ever come across before?
Sylvia Mercer had heard a loud bang at breakfast time. It had startled her dog, Chubby, and she'd called the police.
Well, it's look, it didn't go around, you know, through somebody's roof, isn't it? Or even hit me. I've just said to my son, I haven't even made me will yet.
It had been thought the alleged meteor had penetrated the soil so violently it had severed this electricity cable. Now, what are the chances of that?
As far as to land on land is incredible. To land in the built-up area is incredible. To hit a power cable 5 foot underground is unbelievable.
And he was right to be sceptical. A further 5 hours of investigation established that all was not what it seemed.
This is an electrical fire that is a dead ringer for a meteorite hole, but you win some. This is a meteorite.
The fire had blown the soil upwards. It had fooled everyone, including yours truly.
He's not easily fooled. Let's have a look at the weather forecast for tomorrow. Some sunny periods, but snow showers may develop again, mainly in coastal areas, a top temperature of 4 Celsius. And the outlook for Saturday, well, mainly dry and sunny, but continuing cold. Do take care if you're out and about on the roads overnight, though, because the weather conditions are pretty bad in many parts of the region. That's it from us. Back to Michael Burke now. Good night.
And the main news again tonight, the foot and mouth epidemic has spread to Scotland and Northern Ireland. Tony Blair said tonight it was impossible to say how serious it will become and how long it'll last. Newsnight starting now over on BBC Two. But from 10 o'clock news, good night.
Good evening. It may be the 1st of March today, but winter is staying with us for the next 3 or 4 days, which means more severe night frosts and snow showers. And now it looks as if we've got a risk of more prolonged snow in the south over the weekend before it turns much milder next week. So expect another severe frost over the snowfields tonight. A widespread frost, as you can see, frostier for East Anglia and the southeast, and those harsh frosts will stay with us through Friday night through the weekend before the frost gradually diminishes into next week. The blues replaced by milder greens here, which indicates that the frost should diminish. And that's because we pick up a southwesterly wind, a milder direction for us coming in off the Atlantic, but that will bring a snowstorm and some heavy rain and possible flood problems. And before we even get there, we've got a problem come Saturday and Sunday. Now, this area of low pressure looks set to move its way eastwards through the channel. We stay in the cold air, and with that weather front brushing the south, we could see some significant snowfall, perhaps as much as 10 centimetres in southern Britain. But for tonight, the snow showers will become confined to coastal regions, perhaps 1 or 2 for parts of Northern Ireland, 2 parts of North Wales as well. But a few freezing cold patches are likely inland, particularly in the north, and it will be quite icy with that widespread frost as well. So watch out for some icy patches in the morning and through tonight if you're travelling. But otherwise, the day should get off to a fairly fine start. Still some snow showers around the coast. The fog will clear quite quickly, but the showers will get going as they did around the middle of the day today, particularly for central and eastern parts of England. A couple of sharp showers could be felt by the time we get to the afternoon into western parts of the Midlands even and the Salisbury Plain, and a few more showers for western parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. So another cold day for all of us, well below the March average. Some of those snow showers for parts of East Anglia could leave us with a couple of centimetres of snow while places down the road stay dry, and it's a similar picture really for the southeast of England. There's also the chance tomorrow of a few more showers for Antrim and Down, and more snow possibly coming into the west later in the day, which may also affect western parts of Scotland, whereas the eastern coast of Scotland may see fewer showers than today. But by tomorrow night we should see some more snow packing into western parts of Scotland, north of North.
A bridge landing on track in Wales. There were 2 incidents in Scotland in July. One, a car crashing through a barrier. In the other, a lorry crashed through a bridge parapet and landed on track. In 1993, a high-speed train avoided becoming involved in an accident with a potential scale of Selby by minutes. A tanker broke through the barriers, rolling down an embankment from the M56 in Cheshire. The tanker was carrying more than 6,000 gallons of kerosene and exploded as it lay across the rail tracks. A passenger train had just passed through. Although the reasons for such accidents are varied, the mere fact that vehicles continue to end up on rail tracks has prompted calls for renewed action.
The pattern is unclear. The end result is very clear. What we know is that where you have a road going over a railway line, there is a possibility, however remote in certain circumstances, that a vehicle may end up on that railway line. Now, that is a hazard. It needs to be identified.
The problem is, as Selby proves, who should be doing that? The lines of responsibility are complex, split between rail tracks, the Highways Agency, and in many cases local authorities. The situation mirrors the disparate nature of the railways post-privatisation, prompting the accusation, just who is in charge?
Here we have the interface between rail track on one hand saying we're running a perfectly safe railway system, nothing wrong with it. The Highways Authority, albeit, and I think some of us may be surprised at this, relying on 30-year-old guidelines or legislation with regard to crash barriers, but they're saying, well, nothing we can do about it. That interface is a problem. It's been a problem throughout the privatised network. This in itself is not a problem of privatisation. It's just a problem of a railway system, or a transport system probably is the better way to address it, a transport system which is not fully integrated.
The rail industry is of course supposed to be addressing the question of safety already. After the disasters at Clapham, Southall, Paddington and Hatfield, a mammoth programme of change is underway. But should the industry also now take on the task of assessing what changes are needed to keep road traffic off the rails?
I don't think that the railways should be burdened with yet more safety requirements. I think it should be up to the Highways Agency and the local authorities to ensure that the railways in their area are protected from cars falling off the road. I think it is up to them to look at the various places, 589 places where motorways go over railways, look at these individually and assess the risks of each one of the potential of a similar accident happening as to yesterday's.
The inquiry into what happened at Selby is expected to report quickly. An HSE spokesman suggested today that the government should consider crash barriers on bridges, but it's clear even that won't prevent all such accidents. It's hard to legislate for acts of God.
Jackie Long reporting. We're joined now by Roy Beryl, who's a signal engineering consultant who used to work on the signals for BR and then for Railtrack. There'll be a lot of people watching and taking in those figures who will be surprised by how high they are.
I'm surprised by how high they are, because certainly in my experience the number of cases where we had a serious incident was not as high as that, and I'm very surprised that those numbers are quoted, and I wonder how many of them are actually from high-speed roads onto high-speed lines.
Now you've got close knowledge of an accident in 1993. Can you tell us, as referred to in Jackie's piece, can you explain what happened there?
Yeah, well, that was the first incident that I've been aware of a vehicle coming off a motorway, a high-speed road, onto a high-speed line. And in fact, this tanker lorry came off the M56 motorway and burst somehow through onto the track. And fortuitously, the timing was not as the timing was at Great Heck. It landed there and blew up and shorted out the overhead power lines, which then stopped everything working, and there wasn't anything closely approaching at the time. Had there been 2 trains approaching that tanker lorry in the way in which has occurred at Great Heck, then the results would have been very, very different.
And we looked at a quote from Intercity at the time who said this was very nearly a major disaster. So do you feel that the industry learnt from that?
Well, it's a question of which part of the industry. As far as we're concerned on the railway, the signalling systems and that are all to protect trains from each other. We haven't had to give our attention to protecting trains from extraneous objects, you know, coming from a motorway. So this lorry landing on that particular case, just in my experience, of something so potentially disastrous.
Oh, so do you agree with the voice we heard in the package there who said it's a hazard that needs to be identified?
It certainly needs to be identified. It certainly is not an act of God. It's an act of man.
Because there was a lot of talk yesterday as 1,000,000 to 1 and so on.
Well, what happened after the initial incident and the initial derailment was extremely unlucky with the positioning of the trains that were there at that time. But you can't rely on luck to avoid these sort of catastrophes.
Do you think it's possible for Railtrack to be in close enough touch with the Highways Authority to get this business of the guardrails on the roads going over railways sorted?
Well, in my opinion, it is the view of the Highways Authority to get it sorted. They've created the hazard in the first place by putting high-speed roads close to high-speed railways. The railways have been there long before the roads were there, and the people that have created the risk, i.e. the high...
Foot and mouth marches on across the land. 8 new cases today. The government throws farmers a lifeline. Livestock will move under license. Fear in France. No cases yet, but they've slaughtered more animals than we have. Only 10 bodies found so far in the wreckage of the Selby train crash. 9 illegal immigrants have been discovered under the Eurostar Express.
And here in the north, more victims of the Selby train crash are named by police. And fury from the families of the Hillsborough disaster victims, as a former policeman is awarded compensation for the stress he suffered on the day.
Good evening. Foot and mouth disease continued to spread fast across the country today as the government tried to find a way for farmers to earn their living. Relatives of those who died had been visiting the crash site to lay flowers.
They came out of the need to see where their loved ones died. The family of one of the victims spent a while at the crash, just taking it all in. It was a difficult and traumatic visit. In the darkness of the twisted carriages, the fingertip search has been awkward, but every inch of this site must be checked for personal belongings. They might help identify the bodies, and almost every item is now precious to the families involved. Poignant reminders of the tragic events. Each item tells a story. One mobile phone display reveals 61 missed calls. The tons of mangled steel have made the work incredibly difficult.
It's quite frightening that a carriage that is seemingly so strong can end up being flung around but like a piece of matchwood and broken apart. Yes, it does make you breath, and particularly when you meet some people who've actually got out and walked out alive.
Across the site, the painstaking search for evidence has continued throughout the day. The Land Rover and what happened to it and the driver is the focus of this investigation. Tonight, more relatives asked to visit the scene. It's a noisy place now, full of machinery. The huge cranes slowly and cautiously lift each of the carriages high into the air, away from the tracks. Confusion still surrounds the final death toll. It's now thought 10 people lost their lives, but that figure could still rise. No one will know for certain until the final piece of wreckage is removed. Catherine Marston, BBC News, North Yorkshire.
9 illegal immigrants have been found hidden under a Eurostar train at Waterloo Station in London this evening. They were discovered after passengers heard banging and raised the alarm. A girl of 3 was among the group of immigrants who say they're Romanian. They're now being questioned by Home Office officials. Asylum seekers are using Eurostar trains despite increasing security checks at Calais. Well, Margaret Gilmore is at Waterloo Terminal now. Margaret, how much more do we know about how these people tried to smuggle themselves into the country?
Michael, it's a remarkable story. They were found, as you say, in a compartment underneath the train, rather like the baggage compartment on a coach. It looks as if they probably got on in Paris, where the train was stationed overnight, under guard. That's now being investigated. They then travelled to London in sub-zero conditions. About half an hour after everyone else had got off the train, somebody heard a banging noise. They were obviously trying to get out, so he raised the alarm, and out they came, 4 men, 4 women, and a 3-year-old girl, claiming to be Romanians and asking for asylum, and they're now being questioned in the terminal behind me here.
Are people going to these sort of lengths because of the tighter controls that are being introduced on the borders?
I think they are becoming increasingly desperate and looking for different ways. There's no doubt about that. There are 1,500 illegal immigrants arriving in this country every single week, and 150 of those, 10%, come in on the Eurostar posing as passengers with a ticket but without a passport. But security checks are getting tighter. Other routes are also being plugged. It's more difficult to get in via lorry, via P&O, via the ferries, more difficult to smuggle in on a freight train. So I think people are becoming increasingly desperate, looking for other ways. And this is the first time that a group like this has been found underneath the train.
Margaret Gilmore, thanks. A man jailed as an IRA terrorist and an armed robber have won damages of several £1,000 for injuries they suffered after trying to...
That could be a factor in disturbing new figures about teacher vacancies. A survey out tomorrow by the Times Educational Supplement and Secondary Heads Association reveals that there could be nearly 10,000 permanent jobs unfilled in secondary schools in England and Wales. In effect, teacher vacancies have more than doubled since September. But some believe that Chris Woodhead himself has contributed to the failure to recruit more teachers. In particular, his claim that as many as 15,000 teachers were unsatisfactory.
I think staff have become more defensive as a consequence of the criticism, and there's been less goodwill. You know, I can remember times in my teaching career where, in the late 1970s, early 80s, where there was so much goodwill and so much fun about what we did. People didn't mind giving up copious amounts of time to do things for the benefit of children. Sadly, some of that has gone.
Perhaps most damaging of all for the government is Chris Woodhead's claim that education ministers have failed to deliver for Tony Blair. Now I smile whenever I read that the most feared words in Whitehall are Tony wants. In my experience, there's an inverse correlation between what Tony wants and what Tony gets.
From my time inside the department and watching it from the outside, I've never seen a time when David Blunkett and Tony Blair had different priorities for the education system. They may both have been frustrated at times by a lack of progress in specific areas, but every major announcement has had the two of them putting out the same message.
I think this government's education policy is all rhetoric, it's all spin, and we've seen no delivery from the government. There is a black hole there. I don't think they know which direction they want to turn in on education. They believe that all they had to do was talk about it a lot, and people would think things were improving.
Tomorrow, Chris Woodhead returns to that theme, the gap between rhetoric and reality. Given voters' scepticism about Labour's ability to deliver, this is a war of words the government needs to win.
Martha Carney. Earlier I spoke to Chris Woodhead and I first asked him whether what he's written and been saying isn't just sour grapes because he's lost the argument with the government.
No, not sour grapes at all. I've said in the article that I've written in today's Telegraph that I accepted David Blunkett, Secretary of State. He's in charge. Whilst I was Chief Inspector of Schools, I tried to exert what influence I could. When I came to the decision that I really wasn't having the impact that I wanted to have, then I realised it was time to go, but no sour grapes at all.
Tell us about this conversation then, the solitary conversation you appear to have had with the Prime Minister, where you met him on a staircase and told him of your concerns, and he said, talk to David Miliband.
Yes, I happened to bump into the Prime Minister at the end of a reception. We had a short conversation. I'm not investing it with great significance, but I took the opportunity to tell him the things that I thought were not going as he wanted them to go. He was concerned, and he wanted me to share my concerns with his officials, which I did, but nothing subsequently happened. And that is part of the theme, really, of what I'm saying today, that I felt very often, talking to both David Blunkett and to the Prime Minister, that they were on the same wavelength. That's what I was led to believe. But in effect, nothing changed, and that became inevitably increasingly frustrating.
But when the Prime Minister referred you to David Miliband, did you have a meeting with him, or
No,
was it a one-off, or what?
I think I met with David after that meeting.
Well, if you took it to its conclusion, you must presumably have some explanation why what you were saying was going nowhere.
Yes, the line that was repeated most often was that chief inspectors of schools don't have to take into account the political constituencies, that only so much can be achieved realistically in politics at any given moment. And to an extent, I accept that. But on the other hand, this is a government that put education as its #1 priority, that prides itself on its radical, modernising drive. So I don't think it was unreasonable for me to expect that the rhetoric of the particular policy initiatives was carried through in their actual delivery.
You said that there's an inverse correlation between what Tony wants and what Tony gets. And yet most people have the view of this government that it is increasingly centralised. How do you put those two pictures together?
Well, you can have a government that's increasingly centralised. The question is whether that centralisation is actually delivering on the ground.
And do you think that it was centralised and that Mr. Blair is powerless?
The approach to education, and I can only speak with any authority about education, is certainly centralised. I mean, everybody accepts that. People have different judgments as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. My argument is that that centralisation has not actually delivered the product that the Prime Minister and the government intended.
But doesn't the government have to live more in the real world than you, Mr. Woodhead, and so they have to do things that work? So, for example, on performance-related pay, where you castigated them, they say, well, Chris, if we'd done what you said we should do, we'd have a full-scale teachers' strike.
Yes, I'm sorry, but what David Blunkett has said I wanted, I didn't want. I didn't argue for a reduction in teachers' pay at all. That is complete nonsense. What I said was that any genuine scheme of performance pay involves annual appraisal of performance against agreed targets, and a bonus is awarded if those targets are met. If the targets are not met, then the bonus isn't awarded. So one year a teacher may get less pay than another year, but the teacher's ordinary salary remains constant. Now that's a very different thing from what the Secretary of State is pretending that I said.
Is it still your view that there are 15,000 incompetent teachers?
No, the last inspection evidence that we had shows that the number of teachers that are judged by inspectors to be teaching poorly is reducing. I think the last figure was about 13,200 teachers. So the reforms are working. And I don't deny that at all. We are seeing progress. The question is the extent to which the progress in our schools is because of, or in spite of, the policies which the government has introduced.
Would you accept a peerage from the Conservative Party if they offered you one?
The Conservative Party haven't offered me a peerage, and I'm not contemplating possibilities that may occur or may not occur at some point in the future.
Well, it sounds as if you might be disposed to accept one if they offered you one.
I have no idea how I would react, and it's a fanciful question because the offer has not been made and there have been no conversations about that possibility whatsoever.
Mr. Woodhead, thanks very much.
Thank you.
In his article, Chris Woodhead wrote that there was a feeling within the Education Department that a day without a new initiative was a wasted day. I spoke earlier to the Education Secretary, David Blunkett, and I asked him whether he took that as an insult.
It's just a throwaway criticism. It's not a constructive, this is what I thought should be done and we didn't do it. But let's have an insult, let's have a knockabout. Now, I don't want that. I think that Chris, in many of the things that he did, achieved what he wanted, which was to reveal what had gone wrong in the past. My job, including through the literacy and numeracy programme, but through many other initiatives, was to put a jigsaw together so that we had a pattern of investment which actually led to raising standards. Now, in the end, you see, let me just finish this. In the end, the question is, were standards rising? And his annual reports and the recent report from the new Chief Inspector not only say they were rising, but in every category, in every age group, in every type of school across the country, teaching has improved and standards have risen.
Right, now
that's the judge and jury,
yes,
isn't
but
it?
if Mr. Blunkett, as you say, he is so good, to use your phrase, in revealing what's gone wrong in the past, why is he so bad, as you see it, in revealing what's going wrong at the moment?
Because it's a total contradiction of everything he said over the 4 years. If you refer back just a few weeks before his resignation, he did an interview in The Guardian when he said he had no problem at all with his working relationship with the Prime Minister and myself. He's saying exactly the opposite today. In his annual report last year, he said standards were rising. Now he's saying that our initiatives didn't raise standards. He says that he's in favour of the literacy and numeracy programme, but nothing else. The rest was a diversion. Actually, the Beacon School Initiative, 1,000 schools with extra money to spread practice, was his damned idea. The man's even criticising his own idea.
Was he in touch with the Prime Minister a lot?
Of course he was in touch with Number 10.
And his advisors, because there's a story about him being in touch with David Miliband and then saying, the Prime Minister said to him, keep up the good work. I talked to Mr. Miliband, he said, and then absolutely nothing happened.
Well, look, this is more about ego than it is about reality. I'll debate publicly with anyone whether a particular policy is working, whether investing in inner-city schools is a diversion.
You presided over a set of initiatives that's wasted taxpayers' money, distracted teachers and encapsulated the worst of the discredited ideology, and a gap has opened up between rhetoric and reality. What do you think on reading that?
Well, I hear the rhetoric. The reality is what people experience on the ground, and I stand entirely by the judgment of parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles who see what's happening to their child in the classroom. Do they want the technology in the classroom that he disparages? Do they want the investment in schools? Do they want 650 schools that were on special measures that have been turned round in record time?
And the red tape he refers to?
And the red tape, of course, there has been red tape. There has been administration. Some of it...
So he's right about that.
Some of it has been necessary. Some of it arose from the Office of Standards and Inspection itself.
Now, when he mentions, as he does, the black hole at the heart of your policies, as he says, and he says it's the failure to understand that education is important because it's intrinsically valuable and not just because it contributes to our social and economic good. You could take that as a compliment, couldn't you? Because you could say that is a recognition that you've made education more vocation-based.
I could, except that I actually agree that education for its own sake, i.e., as Gandhi put it, and we put it in the Green Paper in quoting Gandhi, education with character is crucial, so that we give youngsters the tools to be able to learn, to begin to love learning because they're confident.
But you did, Mr. Blunkett, say your department's role stems from its responsibility for ensuring that the UK has a well-functioning labour market.
Yes, it does. And,
well, that's very different,
and offering people the chance to gain the qualifications, vocational or academic, to get a job is absolutely crucial. So we all agree that education for its own sake is vital. It's very strange to have the term utilitarian used against us when I thought that everything I'd heard over the last 4 years from the former was that he wanted us to concentrate solely, as he does in disparaging the 60-odd initiatives, purely on the basic tools. Now, it's okay.
But which is more important, Mr. Blunkett, the education for vocation or the education being intrinsically valuable?
The two are absolutely interlinked. If you can get youngsters interested in learning because they're going to have a job, because they've got an interest in the vocational subjects they're picking up, they then in turn can be engaged with culture, with art, with learning for its own sake throughout life, I've sought to achieve.
I don't know if you were present at the School Standards Task Force meeting where there was a suggestion that teachers should be redescribed learning professionals. Would you have reacted to that?
I wasn't, but I wouldn't, because people are allowed in a free society to say what they think without either the Secretary of State or the Chief Inspector of Schools slapping them down. We don't have a thought police in the education service.
David Blunkett. The supermarket chain Asda tonight said that its store in Wakefield had run out of pork and lamb because of the foot and mouth crisis. As the disease extends its reach, there was confirmation that it has spread to Scotland and Northern Ireland and thus is now affecting the whole of the UK. This evening the Prime Minister promised a long-term future for farming in Britain after the crisis is over, but it is the immediate effects that farmers are concerned with. As the wholesale price of meat jumps, our economics editor Evan Davis reports on what's happening to the market.
Another day of disruption across the country. 6 more cases today, the first episodes in Scotland, in Dumfries and Galloway, and confirmation of one in South Armagh. Indeed, a man was detained and questioned by agriculture officials in Ulster. The authorities are still trying to trace a consignment of infected sheep imported from Carlisle that may have found their way into the Republic. Meanwhile, more disruption to daily lives. Most National Trust properties are closed. The Kennel Club postponed Craft's dog show in Birmingham. The Cheltenham Racing Festival is in danger. And the man in charge of the national census, due in April, said he's looking at possible alterations to the timetable. But perhaps the most important immediate disruption is in the supply of meat to consumers. With a ban on all movement of livestock, fresh British meat is not replacing the meat we're consuming. The hope for shoppers had been that while we used up remaining stocks, A, consumers would avoid hoarding, and B, that imports could then be found to fill any gap in supply. But life is looking more complicated than that. Paul Robinson of John Robinson Butchers in Stockbridge, Hampshire, says that he only has 5 bodies of beef, 20 pigs and 60 lambs left. People are buying a lot more than usual.
They are buying in bulk, which this didn't happen a few days ago, but when the government announced that the ban is going to be another 14 days before any livestock going into the abattoir, people who demand the best and don't want cheap food that is likely to be infected, they're stocking up and filling their freezers.
Among bigger meat traders, there was a decided attempt to instill confidence. Tesco said there had been a fairly steep increase in sales with some gaps on shelves, but they stressed stocks were plentiful and they were still delivering large quantities to stores. We spoke to Burger King, who said they had an ample supply of beef, and we spoke to Birdseye, who said it was business as usual, although they also said their people are looking at other arrangements. But how easy is it for imported supplies to fill any gap left by the British? In fact, right here, right now, it doesn't turn out to be that easy. From New Zealand, for example, Europe sets a cap on lamb imports, and the country's already using it all up. There's still pressure to get more lamb in, though.
It normally comes here by ship. Most of our meat arrives by ship. We have it down to a fine art. But we are under intense pressure at the moment to air freight product into the marketplace, which is a very expensive exercise, and we are doing that. But our problem is we only have limited supplies.
Pork is also very much in demand. Recent BSE scares have driven the Germans away from beef. Not surprisingly, Europe's providers are not so interested in saving Britain's bacon. They have a market in Europe to serve. So wholesale prices in all meats reflect the shortage.
But as far as beef is concerned, we're seeing increases of somewhere between 15 and 20%. Pork is between 30 and 50%. And lamb, if there's any home-produced lamb still about, then it's around about 50% more expensive than it was this time last week.
The difficult conditions are particularly hurting the smaller retailers who don't have the same access to imported meat and who don't have long-term supply contracts.
There was a container coming into the port down near Southampton of Irish beef. We certainly would have been interested in some, but one of the multiple supermarkets stepped in and bought the whole boatload. So there's absolutely none available for us whatsoever.
You might be surprised at all this. Didn't you think there are surpluses of farm products everywhere? Well, interestingly, the world has become a much more just-in-time place than it used to be. Lots of industries operate on leaner margins than they used to, as keeping surpluses costs money. And the heady days of huge European meat mountains have gone too, and that makes it much harder to replace missing supplies. Around the world, agriculture has, in some measure, found itself responding to market pressures and directing its production accordingly.
Well, in New Zealand, we have changed, if you like, the base of agriculture. We used to be very, very reliant on sheep and beef, but now the market has changed and we are now more reliant maybe on dairying, on viniculture for wine, for pip fruit, now for forestry. So the guys that were doing sheep and beef are still there, but they're doing it at a lower level than maybe 20 years ago.
The longer the crisis persists, the easier it will be for world supplies to respond to Britain's shortage. What a tragic irony for British farmers, that while they see the first big livestock price hikes of late, all they can do is watch as others try and take the business.
Evan Davis reporting. We're joined now by our political editor, Martha Carney, to discuss the repercussions of the crisis, because today there was just a shadow of a hint from the Agriculture Minister that possibly there could be a look at the election date.
Yes, I mean, this is an area of obsessive interest for us journalists and politicians, probably not for the people who are suffering the consequences of foot and mouth disease. What the Agriculture Minister said was that he was warning MPs and political activists to stay away from farms. And then he said the implications of that are obvious, hinting at a delay in the election, which is actually something that people in the party have been talking about for a few days. You may remember Douglas Henderson on Newsnight a couple of days ago said that an autumn election was now looking increasingly likely.
Do you think they will actually change it?
I think what you have to understand is the whole Millbank party headquarters machine has been geared up for months to go for an election on May 3rd. So it's going to be quite a big deal to shift them away for that. Now, if the foot and mouth disease is still in full spate, as it were, it's going to be very difficult, not simply because candidates can't get onto the farms to campaign, people can't get out to vote, but also the political implications. I mean, so far, Labour people think that they're not being blamed in any way for foot and mouth disease. They say, look at the fuel crisis. That began as a simple protest about petrol, but actually developed into something much more fundamental about the way people regarded the election. So they're going to be keeping a very close eye on how this all develops.
Now, the Times tomorrow morning has got a story about a Conservative peer allegedly trying to pay the UK Independence Party not to stand in certain seats.
Yes, that's right. It's essentially a story about not wanting to split the Eurosceptic vote. And the allegation is that Lord Pearson of Rannoch offered up to £2 million to candidates in the UK Independence Party in order for them not to stand against similarly Eurosceptic candidates in the Conservative Party. Now, we've spoken to the UK Independence Party and they said that they were approached by an intermediary, but once, as it were, the offer began to become a little bit public, then it was simply blown out of the water.
And any Conservative reaction, Preeti?
Yes, the Conservative Party says that it doesn't do deals with anyone. Lord Pearson appears to have acted alone and certainly didn't consult with Conservative Central Office. But they did say tonight they're not considering withdrawing the whip from Lord Pearson.
Martha Carney, thank you very much indeed. 3 of Bill Clinton's closest aides gave telling evidence today at the congressional inquiry into the presidential pardon for the fugitive financier Mark Rich, which Mr. Clinton, of course, activated as he left office. John Podesta, his former chief of staff, said he'd advised against the pardon, as had his very close aide, Bruce Lindsay. Without the oomph of the White House behind him, Mr. Clinton has looked at sea as he's tried to stop the accusations against him piling up. Our correspondent, Peter Marshall, reports from Washington.
This is the heart of the final Get Clinton operation. The offices where document is stacked upon document, all to build the case that his presidency ended shamefully, with midnight clemency for billionaires, drug dealers and con men, those with the means to pay for pardons.
Swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Today, before a congressional committee, Bill Clinton's 3 closest White House advisors and one of their former colleagues who was lobbying for the billionaire Clinton pardoned. Their testimony is crucial to understanding how extraordinary this affair is, for all 3 said that they'd opposed the pardon and were surprised it happened.
I did not have the sense at that meeting, or until the 19th, that he really was inclined to grant the pardon.
And does that comport with your understanding, Mr. Lindsay, and yours, Mr. Podesta?
I clearly left the meeting understanding that no decision had been made. I don't know if I knew what was in his mind.
Mr. Podesta?
No, I thought he accepted our judgment, and I didn't think that this was a particularly active matter.
Amid yet another Clinton scandal with multiple investigations, it's sometimes hard to remember he's no longer the president. What with the embarrassment of having to return the federal furniture they'd taken, and now the row over the pardons, no wonder it's being claimed the Clintons ran the White House as a cash and carry operation. All the many controversial pardons may have been granted by Bill Clinton alone, but a wide range of characters have been pressing into act. These are the Clinton pardon go-betweens, and some of them are particularly damaging to Hillary Clinton. Looming largest and closest to home is Hugh Rodham, Hillary Clinton's brother. He's a lawyer who got $400,000 after lobbying for 2 pardons. Now he's at the end of his tether and choking.
I can't talk about this. I won't talk about it. And it doesn't matter how long you guys sit out here. It's not going to make a difference.
He also maintains he said nothing to his golf partner Bill Clinton about the money he'd made from Clinton's pardoning of his clients, Glenn Braswell, a con man who sold baldness cures, and Carlos Vignali, a major dealer in cocaine. Hillary Clinton, whose popularity rating is now the same as Nixon's when he quit, says she's mortified by what her brother did.
As soon as we found out Monday night, I was heartbroken and shocked by it, and, you know, immediately said this, you know, this is a terrible misjudgment, and the money had to be returned, and that's what we worked on.
She claims also to be puzzled by the money paid to her campaign treasurer, William Cunningham, for his efforts in organising 2 further pardons.
With respect to Mr. Cunningham, I knew nothing about that, but I know that he is, you know, a fine lawyer and a fine man.
Now Hillary herself stands accused of being a go-between, pressing for pardons for a group of Hasidic Jews convicted of fraud. Again, she denies any wrongdoing. As a direct result of Bill Clinton issuing 144 pardons in his final hours in office, a separate committee is now reviewing the constitutional role of the pardon. Margaret Love, who's been giving evidence, for 10 years worked on pardons under Reagan, Bush, and finally Clinton. By her account, Bill Clinton wasn't venal, merely fed up with his own Justice Department and its Attorney General Janet Reno. So he decided to leave them out.
There are Justice Department procedures that ensure that the President, in exercising this power, will have the benefit of the advice of his Attorney General. And that's always been the case, and it links the pardon power very much to the justice system, as opposed to some sort of personal, private power that can be bestowed on friends.
And you didn't approach the Attorney General in this case?
Well, there were a number of cases that he decided that apparently did not go through the ordinary Justice Department procedures at all.
Not all the go-betweens are alleged to have profited themselves. The scandal began with revelations about the pardon for the billionaire financier and fugitive Mark Rich. He's been in exile in Switzerland for 18 years, having fled charges of tax evasion and trading with the enemy, variously Iran, Iraq, and Libya. When an American reporter caught up with Mr. Rich on the ski slopes of St. Moritz, he again took flight.
The whole country wants to know, did you give any money at all to President Clinton? Mr. Rich, really?
In the case of the Rich pardon, his ex-wife Denise had lobbied hard while contributing $1.5 million to the Clintons and the Democrats. Her friend, Beth DeZortz, a former Democratic Party treasurer, also pressed for a Rich pardon, meanwhile pledging to raise $1 million for the Clinton Presidential Library. The big question, was the Rich pardon linked to these contributions? DeZortz today revealed nothing.
Upon the advice of my counsel, I respectfully decline to answer that question based on the protection afforded me under the United States Constitution.
The committee chairman, Dan Burton, believes the refusal to speak is telling.
What we want to do is find out why they feel that they're in jeopardy by testifying. It certainly raises a lot of questions in our mind. That's why we're looking into this. And it also raises questions in the mind of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. So all we want to do is get the facts out, find out what happened. If there was anything illegal that happened, we'll pursue that. If not, it was just bad judgment, then that'll be the end of it.
While Clinton's allies are incredulous and despairing, his long-term enemies are delighted at this unexpected attempt to finally drive a stake through the heart of the Clinton era. Chief among them, the committee chairman, Dan Burton, a man who once shot at a melon in an attempt to prove how Clinton's aide, Vince Foster, had been murdered. He hadn't. When Bill Clinton made a spoof video last year for Washington Correspondent, he aimed a shot specifically at his would-be nemesis, Congressman Burton.
Yes!
That was then. Now we find Dan Burton determined to have the last laugh and using the pardons affair to get it.
I believe that the administration did a lot of things that were questionable legally and unethical, and I believe that the last thing he did was a manifestation of that. We want to find out why the president pardoned some of these people who were fugitives from justice, some of the most wanted people in the world. We want to find out if there was any connection between contributions that were made to the president to the president's library or to his brother or others if there was any quid pro quo.
A full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
Of course, there have always been controversial pardons. Gerald Ford was never forgiven for letting off Richard Nixon. And when Caspar Weinberger and 5 other Reagan-Bush officials were pardoned over Iran-Contra, it looked like a tactic to stop their damaging testimony. Congress turned a blind eye. The senior Democrats today, although critical of Clinton, maintain this shows he's the victim of a double standard. While investigators focus on a mass of emails lobbying Clinton's aides, the aides themselves have their own theory of why Clinton granted his most egregious pardon to Mark Rich. They suggest he may have ignored their advice because instead he was listening to his contemporaries around the globe.
Mr. Bradamus, who is a friend of King Juan Carlos of Spain, called to tell me that he had received a message from the king. The message concerned the Rich pardon case. Mr. Bradamus told me that he understood Israel's foreign minister, Shlomo Ben-Ami, had visited the king to brief him on the Middle East peace process and had raised the Rich case. The staff informed the president that it was our view that the pardon should not be granted. On Friday afternoon, January 19th, the president talked to Prime Minister Barak in a farewell call. While the bulk of that call concerned the situation in the Middle East, Prime Minister Barak raised the Rich matter at the end and asked the president once again to consider the Rich pardon.
Which is more or less what Clinton's written in his own defense. Today, America's worst-dressed man was in New York, the city where prosecutors are investigating the Rich and other pardons. Any charges now would be a huge shock. There's a feeling this affair may have run its course, a shabby postscript to the last 8 years.
Peter Marshall, in a moment to look at tomorrow's papers, but first a roundup of today's news stories. Our main story tonight, Newsnight has learned that yesterday's rail crash began with an incident that happens frighteningly often on Britain's railways. The health and safety executive says 30 cars or lorries have ended up on railway tracks over the past 3 years. The trial of the man accused of murdering Jill Dando has been adjourned for almost 2 months until April the 23rd. The court forbade reporting of the reasons for the decision. The judge also ruled that the British media can now only use this picture of Barry George, who denies killing Jill Dando in April 1999. Villagers living along the lower reaches of the Zambezi River in Mozambique tonight face yet more floods. The rising waters coming down the Zambezi flow from a series of overloaded dams further upstream. The country has only 4 helicopters available to deal with the floods, which have left 80,000 people homeless. The row over the government's plans to privatise London Underground came closer to the High Court today. Transport for London, the new body that oversees the city's travel system, authorised London's new Transport Supremo, Bob Kiley, to test the Treasury's scheme in court. And the markets, the FT 100 share index finished a little down, while in New York the Dow Jones was also down. Against the pound, the euro stayed unchanged. Against the dollar, sterling went up. Just a very quick look at tomorrow morning's front pages. The Guardian, first of all, outbreak, foot and mouth. Of course, they're referring to spreads all over the UK. Financial Times, again, foot and mouth infects Ulster and Scotland, but also a story here by Robert Shrimsley and Rosemary Bennett. Minimum wage set to rise by 10%, they are predicting in the FT. The Times, 8 days to save the countryside, and again, foot and mouth. And the rail crash driver was not a sleepwife, says they're pointing out that if he was, it could produce Britain's biggest car insurance claim. The Mail has the front page headline, Did He Fall Asleep at the Wheel? And the Sun leads with £330,000 for Hillsborough cop. He sparked fury by winning compensation for post-traumatic stress suffered in the Hillsborough disaster. Very quick clarification for you. In Evan Davis's piece earlier, we should have said sheep were bought from Longtown Market near Carlisle. That's all from Newsnight tonight, but if you want more, there's news coverage round the clock on BBC News 24. I'll be back tomorrow with Mark Lawson in the all-new Newsnight Review. You can find more details from the Newsnight website. Till then, from all of us on the programme, very good night.
Hello and a very good evening to you. We haven't seen the last
of the wintry weather yet. In fact, there are some severe frost to come.
Make that two and forget.
You can manage without him. As you wish.
Relax in the carefree atmosphere of old English charm. When you are there.
I hope we're not intruding on your dinner hour.
Oh, not at all, no. You're American.
That's right.
Where are you from?
California.
How lovely. You're English, though?
Yes, but I've been over there 10 years now.
10 years. Do you ever get homesick?
Oh, yes, but I love it there. The climate's so wonderful. You can swim and sunbathe, and then after lunch, drive up into the mountains and ski.
How wonderful.
I like England and the English people, but I sure couldn't take this climate.
Harry finds it too gloomy.
Oh, I don't find it too gloomy, do you, Sybil?
Yes, I do, Basil.
Oh, yes, my wife finds it too gloomy. I find it rather bracing.
What do you find bracing, Basil? The damp, the drizzle, the fog?
Well, it's not always like this, dear. It changes.
My husband's like the climate. He changes. This morning he went on for 2 hours about the bloody weather.
It has been unusually damp this week, in fact, but normally we're rather spoiled down here on the English Riviera.
Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton were telling me about California. You can swim in the morning, and then in the afternoon you can drive up into the mountains and ski.
Must be rather tiring.
Well, one has a choice.
Yes, well, I don't think it would suit me. I rather like it down here. It's very mild all the